Uh, Good afternoon. As promised, this is the recording of the class that I did for OSher USF in person on Himalayas. Okay, and I've had fun preparing this class, and hopefully some of you will enjoy all the trivia, facts, history, and science that I've discovered while preparing this class. Okay, so let's get started. The word Himalaya means abode of the snow. That's actually a Sanskrit word. Now, when the British Himalayan explorers first came across this, they were struggling as to how to pronounce this word. The origin of the word is in Sanskrit, and the stress there is on the second syllabus. In the West, somehow the stress is given on the third syllabus, and the reason for that is not quite clear. And one of the founders of the Himalayan climbing club, a man named Geoffrey Cobbett, in 1920s, he actually had a conference of various experts from different representatives of different states that are surrounding the Himalayas. And obviously they came up to the finally this conclusion, and somehow or the other there is the word is pronounced differently by the Indian nationals, Himalaya and Himalaya versus so. And obviously in Indic languages, the second A is implied, is does not necessarily pronounce as plural, but enough on that. Now, the region of Himalaya, there is more to it than just Mount Everest and the various mountains. Okay, that's where most of the Westerners' knowledge is limited. But when we as we look at it, the details, there's a whole history dating back to thousands of years in this region. It is literally the crossroads of Asia, okay, which just on the southern border of the Silk Road, and part of trade route for thousands of years, and cross cultures between the two major religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and to a lesser extent Islam, and uh, and the trade, of course. And there is one other religion of original Tibetan religion named pronounced Bun, which I will get that when we next week when we talk about Tibet in general. And obviously, politically, this has been of interest to the Chinese dynasties in the various kingdoms. And the European or Western interest dates back to Alexander when he went through the Karakoram and tried to reach the border of modern day Punjab, almost nearing Kashmir, when his troops decided they had enough of it and he turned back. And obviously, this region figures widely in the so-called Great Game, which went on between the Tsarist Russia that was expanding through the modern-day stans and the British Empire that was afraid of Russian invasions. And last but not the least, when mountain climbing became popular in the early 20th century, varieties of actors from all over the world have factored into it. Obviously, the British tried to monopolize it, but the others had their share. The Germans were adventurous, and various explorers have made their attempts at climbing varieties of mountains as a challenge. And this is, this is not original, but this was quoted from one of the books that I read, Best Way to Get High Without Drugs, of course. Okay, and how do I get the idea for this? This idea came from being a Monty Python fan, from the great travel writer and BBC TV presenter Michael Palin, who started out his efforts with around the world in 80 days, duplicating Jules Verne's famous journey. And then some other ones that he took was from pole to pole, north to south, and then went to along the Pacific Rim, and one of them was Himalayas. And by traditionally, most of the Westerners who start from Afghanistan or Pakistan, if they're lucky enough to get visa for Afghanistan, or brave enough or foolish enough to go through Afghanistan, okay, and then obviously they would go to Pakistan, where obviously, and they would go to the border over the Pamir region, and then gradually migrated to Kashmir, crossing the ever fragile border, and which military competition between India and Pakistan since 47, and then make a pilgrimage to the great Dalai Lama, venture into India a little bit, and then go into an area called Little Tibet, which is less known to this, and then try to obtain visa for Tibet, then travel the smaller kingdoms of Sikkim, Bhutan, and Nepal, the Kathmandu, of course, and then end up in near Bay of Bengal and in Myanmar, which was the scene of the Burma-China War in 1947, 1940s during the Second War. Okay, so this would be the normal route. Just to familiarize most of you with the political map, okay, and this is the arrow is of significance. But before we get into the arrow, let me just see if I can see. If obviously I'm recording this after the in-person class, so I can't ask questions. But the year 1498 has as much significance for that part of the area as 1492 is for the New World. Obviously, every American knows what 1492 stands for, but 1498 was equally important because when the Portuguese explorers went around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and ended up on the west coast of India in a place called Diu, and later on into Goa. And that was the first encounter of Europeans with looking for spices, good Christians, and obviously for trade. And so that was, now the Portuguese were the first, followed by Dutch, then French, and last but not the least, the Brits. And they ventured in 1601. This arrow is important. This is a small town. It's not small anymore, but it is about, say, 90 miles from Mumbai, or Bombay, as it used to be called, and is Surat. That's important because that's my city of birth. And I went to school in a princely state between Ahmedabad and Surat, called Vadodara or Baroda, as the Brits were pronouncing it. And so but that's personal history. And now, just to orient people, obviously the big land mass that you can see is China, followed by India. So the two big, most populous countries in the world, followed by the division of India, which took place in 47, which is now the part is Pakistan, and up here is where Kashmir is, okay, and then Afghanistan, and there's a little area that the lip of Afghanistan that extends and borders China. Okay, and then moving east, this is Kathmandu, is where Nepal is, and Thimbu is Bhutan, which is tiny, and even tinier in between is a small former princely state, which is now part of the Indian Union. It's called Sikkim. And then obviously this part is Assam, which is the tea estates are, and then we are going into Burma, or the new name being Myanmar. Okay, so that gives you an idea type of things. Now, India, just like Europe, is a conglomerate of various linguistics and political units of states. But unlike the United States, the central government is strong, and controls the purse. So, and they've created a lot of linguistic states since 1950s, and there are now about 27 states at the last count. And so this is the political geography of the area. And we'll talk about the geology and other stuff as we move right along. Okay. Okay, now this region has what? Oh, got it. Yeah, oh, okay. I paused, yeah. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, and now, obviously, so that gives you the idea as to what we'll be talking about, mountaineering. We'll talk a little bit about the geology, and talk about some of the peculiarities of each and every small and big countries. Okay, and that's the general plan. Now, what is the future hold for this region? Obviously, the water and the climate change is going to be a big factor. And there are billions of people depend upon this watershed, and the three powerful countries, which are not exactly good neighbors, come into the picture, which is China, India, and not to be outdone, Pakistan. And while China and India have no first use policy for nuclear weapons, but the Islamic Republic of Pakistan does not have that policy. So it is obviously that may does not speak well for the future. Okay, now obviously all of you are familiar with the concept of Silk Road, which traveled on from China all the way to Islamic areas and later on into Europe for trading. But now that is being replaced by the Belt Road Initiative by China. And that is very much a fact of life that the China has successfully built railroads all the way from eastern China and to the train route all the way to Yugoslavia. And there is something called the dry terminals that have been built, and it's in there extending. Obviously, they have a nice railroad from Xinjiang province to Lhasa, the former Tibet capital, and they're extending it through Nepal. And obviously, there is already a pre-existing rail link between Nepal and India. So it can be a north-south connection as well. And the other route would be, that there is a big highway that has been built called the Karakoram Highway, which gives China access to the to the Gulf states, so they can get access to the seaport, which is bordering between Karachi in Pakistan and Iran. Okay, now and there are varieties of, obviously, we'll talk at length about various religions. And last but not the least, the uh, tragedy or liberation of Tibet, depending upon your point of view, whether that are, what are the long-term consequences of that as to, and last but not importantly, this region is extremely rich on water. So hydroelectricity, each and every country is trying to generate hydroelectricity and trying to segue away from coal. Okay, and this has been, and each country is trying to outdo each other by building bigger and bigger dams, and which we'll talk about at length. And then dams are good for generating electricity, but obviously this is a very volatile geological zone, and there is more prone for earthquakes, and the flooding is can be a nightmaring scenario. And the commercialization of mountaineering will play a big role in our talk as we go along. Okay, and now again, the areas of Himalayas, you can see these are the big, there is more to this region than just Himalayas, varieties of mountains. They're starting from, again, from the west called Hindu Kush. The word is Persian, Arabic word, and Hindu Kush means death to the Hindus. Okay, and the Pamir is the so-called roof of the world. Okay, and there is a small, less known mountain range called Kunlun Mountain through all the stans around there. And then obviously there's something called the Greater and the Lesser Himalayas that extend all the way from modern day Kashmir to Burma. Okay, and these are some of the bigger mountains that I have listed. In the Karakoram range, there is the so-called Nanga Parbat. Okay, and then moving down further, there is the Mount Kailash, which is the holy pilgrimage site for Hindus and Tibetans, and Dalgari, which are all the some of the prominent 8,000 meter mountains that are outlined, and the big one being Mount Everest and Kanchenjunga. So, okay, so I'll have more science to say. And for whatever reasons, Nanga Parbat has been a fascination of the Germans. Okay, and there is also K2, which is the second highest peak that has also been, the Germans have made severe attempts at climbing it, and with considerable risk to the climbers. And the reason why they selected that, because the British who controlled the access to the Himalayas did not give permit to the Germans, because it became a national pride many times. Okay, and the climate of this area is very varied, from extreme deserts, in the Tibetan plateau, where there is barely 2 to 5 inches of rain per year, to some of the wettest place in the world in this region, and where it can rain as much as 400 inches per year. And at the same time, there is a huge amount of rock dust and the mountain erosion that washes down into the Bay of Bengal, okay, from these mighty rivers. Okay, and not surprisingly, there is a huge biodiversity in this region, which I'll refer to as we go along. Okay, and now these are the 10 highest peaks in the Himalayan range. So as you can see, that this excludes the so-called Karakoram range. Okay, starting out with Mount Everest, the second one is Kanchenjunga, and then there are other ones that are lesser well-known, and they're relatively easier to climb if there is anything such as easy climbing. And Dalgari is a mispronunciation. I think the original words would be Davalgiri. Okay, and Nanga Parbat, this means the naked mountain. Annapurna means the one that provides food. And Nanda Devi is one of the mythological goddesses of India. Okay, and some of these other ones are probably part of the Tibetan language, so I don't have a literal translation. Okay, and and a lot of these were carried out by the Trigonomic Survey of India, which I'll talk more as we go along. And this with mountain climbing, the word Sherpa came into common use, okay, which are the native people of the Tibetan highland and modern day Nepal, and they were genetically adapted for climbing high mountains. Now, so these are again the 14 peaks in more details, starting from Nanga Parbat, the K2, which is deadliest this thing, and some of the other ones that did not make that list. Okay, and now it becomes like doing marathons on all continents. This becomes a challenge for the mountain climbing experts or climbers who take it upon themselves to successfully climb all 14. There are very few hardy souls who have done that, so it's a very exclusive club. But just as recently, I'll talk about it when we talk about Sherpas. There's a documentary of one of the Sherpas with the name Nirmal Purja. He managed to climb all 14 in 7 months. So that is a record that I doubt very well will be equaled. Okay, and then the biggest well-known mountaineer was a guy named Reinhold Meißner, who was a German, and some of these mountains have a huge religious significance for the local population, and so this is, and sometimes the Westerners, to their credit, have given respect to the native local feelings. For example, the first people who made it to Kanchenjunga peak from Sikkim did not climb the last 6 feet due to request from the king of Sikkim to avoid that. So And at the same time, a lot of time, the people who use the Sherpas for assisting their climb or making it easier do respect and attend the puja and try to get the blessing of the lamas and the Sherpas, okay, as the case may be. And because obviously it's a very risky hazard, this passion, and for which and it may not help, but it doesn't hurt. Now, let's get down to the one thing that most of you would associate it with mountain climbing, which is Everest. And this is a fascinating story as to how the name came about. Now, the letters in the word, the GTS, it's not a typo, it doesn't have to do with GPS, but the word stands for the Great Trigonometric Survey of the Indian Subcontinent. This was undertaken even in the early 19th century by the honorable or dishonorable, as your feelings may be, of East India Company of the Indian subcontinents. And to their credit, why they did that, perhaps for taxing the area in a more scientific manner and doing survey of the land and the resources, or there was scientific interest as well. And at that time, the geography and the Enlightenment had rubbed on so that they allocated several £1,000s to this survey with the impression that they'll finish in 5 to 10 years, which took them to complete them, took them almost 70 years. And there were some very, very devoted, mathematically inclined young men. There were no women in those days. With the able assistance of locals, okay, they carried the vertically facing telescope and theodolites and meticulously measured the highest points and were applying various corrections for the curvature of the earth, curvature of the land, and taking precise recording and doing various trigonometric triangles. So it was an effort in geometry and geography and mapping out the land. Okay, so and now the person that was one of the superintendents of the survey, he was a guy named George Everest. Fittingly, he was born in Greenwich, and his family has heritage dating back to the 17th century in the Greenwich area. And he went to a military academy in Britain, and at the age of 16, he was sent out to make his fortune for the East India Company, starting what now he was mathematically talented. So he started working from the low end, and over the years rose to be the superintendent of the survey. And for this work, he was recognized by the Royal Geographic Society, by the Royal Society, and was made a fellow. And his work was continued by a guy named Wog following. And as they were surveying the mountains, when the East India Company was started out in Calcutta, which is a big city in Bengal, Bay of Bengal. So when they went to the northern side, they were able to visualize the Himalayas on a clear day. In those days, there wasn't that much pollution, I suspect. So and triangulation method was applied, and they could clearly see that these were some gigantic mountains. So with the help of a Indian Bengali Pandit who had trained at the Hindu College of Calcutta and was very gifted in mathematics and had obtained a bachelor's degree and was working as an assistant and became almost a right hand of George Everest. And even after Everest retired and returned to England for health reasons, Radhanath Sitkar continued working with the men who headed the survey. And then on sometime in mid 19th century, he was able to measure the peak, which was they labeled as a peak 15 of the mountains. And with precise trigonometric calculations, he calculated the height to be 29,000 feet. And just to make sure that they weren't fudging figures, his boss added 3 feet. So, and they published their data into the academic journal. and rightly, and to be, and it was nice that even though he was Indian and working under the Brits, he was given credit for his work in the first two publications. Then somewhere along the line, he wrote some articles protesting a local magistrate, and his name was removed from the third publication of the Geological Society publication in India. Obviously, they were all in English later on, and he died at a relatively young age. But so there's a collaboration that took place between the young mathematician Indian and the British officers who were surveying the area. And he was one of the first ones to really study Newton's Principia, and on his own, he had discovered varieties of methods for trigonometric calculations. Okay, because before that, the impression was that Kanchenjunga, which was close to it, was that one of the tallest mountains. Okay, and so this is surprisingly good accuracy from 140 kilometers away. And the measurement holds true. That current measurement is about 29,000 and 29 feet up. Okay, and as we'll talk about, due to geological formations, the mountains are rising. Okay, now, and the big event that took place, which I'm sure made around the world, around the news, because after the Second World War, people could have used some good news. That was in 1953, and that was, in the DNA discovery that took place with Crick and Watson. Okay, and they walked in. The brass young people walked in and said, "We have discovered the secret of life." The second was Mount Everest climbing, and the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. Okay, so these were the three things. So, and obviously, in the British expedition was the Commonwealth venture. So even though Hillary was a New Zealander, was part of the expedition, and they went out in teams. They used supplemental oxygen. They had learned some hard lessons from the earlier expeditions that took place under a well-known, or the most obsessive death that took place in 1932, which we'll talk about later on. And so, and the young Sherpa, Tenzing Norway, was assisting him. And so after the first team had to return back due to the fact that they were physically exhausted and they were likely to run out of oxygen on May 22nd. And so later on, the second team, that is Hillary and Tenzing, made the effort, and they were successful. And the rest is history. And they obviously, and as the highest point was reached on May 29th at 11:30 a.m. And then Hillary was obviously, it was an experienced mountain climber. And after the south summit, ridge takes a slight dip before rising abruptly to a rocky spur of about 40 feet, before the real summit. Okay, so he was able to climb up to this, and this summit forever has been named as a Hillary Summit, Hillary Step. Okay, and more about that when we talk about. But as one can easily guess, mountain climbing is a risky business, and risky business may bring to the memory of the movie that made Tom Cruise a movie star. And so much so that the Indian government finally has thrown up their hand, and instead of trying to make the road more safe, they have just decided it was cheaper to put up a sign, "You are traveling the most treacherous road." So one can say at least that who says the government doesn't have humor? Okay, and this is a picture that is taken from a more recent travel book by a Swedish traveler, young woman named Erika, unfortunate last name of Erika Fatman, and she travels the same route that Michael Palin traveled in the 80s. Okay, and so this is her slide. So you can see that this is written in Hindi as well as in English, the two accepted languages of the Indian Union. Okay. And again, this region is not just the avalanche, but earthquakes, landslide, bad weather, everything becomes, and we'll see some of the most horrendous disasters have taken place well documented over the last 200 years. when we started documenting things, but I'm sure they've gone on for a lot longer time. Okay, now this just gives you an idea about how risky this thing that, well, Mount Everest is not, this the most well known, but it's not the most risky as to climb. Okay, the Everest is considered relatively easy with all the access and the assistance, but the fatality rate is far less than those of the other ones. You can see that the K2 and Kanchenjunga, are the two of the deadliest, as well as Annapurna. I mean, so you have a almost 1 out of 4 chance of not making it. Okay, so it's not for the faint-hearted, and the others are right behind it. And the easiest one, which the people who are attempting the big thanks climb, is the one called Makalu. Okay, and as recently as, just to see that I'm doing my homework, was the article just from a few days ago in the BBC winter series or travel series about why do people want to risk everything to climb these deadly peaks. And perhaps, it's glory or challenge or a dopamine kick, so, and obviously it's a passion that human beings, so, so if you're interested, you can look into that. And obviously here's a quote from that in what would be later known as the 2008 K2 disaster. uh, After a similar one in 1981 and 1986. 5 people died on the mountain. Ice avalanche swept away climbers' rope lines, causing them to fall in the treacherous section known as bottleneck. And this killed 11 climbers. Okay, and some of them were survived with a frostbite and severe other injuries. So that was so it's really was a big tragedy of monumental proportions. And there were other ones that have taken place on Everest as well. Some of them were through no fault of the mount from earthquakes and abrupt avalanche. Now, these are some of the facts about the Himalayan range with focusing on it, that they extend 4,000 kilometers. Sorry about the numbers and kilometers because they are taken from the British books. Okay, and now they're not the longest. The Andes Mountains in South America are longest, and now this does not, if we include the Pamir and Hindu Kush and Karakoram, they become longer. Okay, now the area which we'll talk about is Tibet, which is not small, may look small on the map that I showed you earlier because it is squeezed between two large masses of India and China, but it is 5 times bigger than the country of France. Okay, and it's entirely at an altitude of 4,500 meters. So it's almost more than 10,000 feet. Okay, and the climate, as I mentioned, is very varied from desert to temperate to tropical. Okay, and the valley. So and the rain can vary substantially. And 1 kilometer of upward climb, the temperature can drop up to as much as 6 degrees centigrade. Okay, and there is so much water in this region that it can be rightly called a third pole. Okay, all right, and so and some of these mountains are still rising due to the geological processes. And we talked about, and there are the magical 14, which is 8,000 meters, which are the ones that most people go after. And then there is this old journal that was published, goes back from the early 20th century, the Himalayan Gazetteer of the district at the northwest province of India. Okay, so these were some of the reports that were carried out. Okay, and are still very useful. Now, you can say among the 8,000 meters, Hillary was not the first one. The first one to climb the difficult mountain of Annapurna was a Frenchman with a very French-sounding name of Maurice Herzog. Yes, indeed, he was a Jewish citizen. Okay, was a mountain climber, and in 1950 he was first one to be successfully climb Annapurna mountain, which has a high fatality. Now, again, rightly so, he went on to become a French hero. Okay, and later on, now he obviously that was not a cakewalk by any means. he froze his fingers and toes and needed amputation, and wisely retired from the profession with this handicap. And then he wrote a very successful book, which was translated to many languages, went on to sell 11 million copies. And there are other Annapurnas in the lives of men. And rightly, he was recognized as the French hero during the Paris Olympic. Here he's waving the French flag and carrying the part of the Olympic torch. Okay. And he became, additional fact of interest, became Minister of Sport for France. Okay. And now the comparison of the tallest one as to the most difficult one, K2. Okay, you can see that the Himalayas and Karakoram mountain range and the K2, okay, which is again over 28,000 feet, but much more difficult due to 45-degree slope from the base camp. Okay, and they were all discovered in 1956, and it took almost 100 years to climb. On the other hand, Everest has become a walk in the park for the challengers as well as for the paying customers, and it's becoming commercialized ad nauseum. Okay, and this is the data, which is just mind-boggling, that in 75 years, which is from 1953 to 2024, as many as 7,000 people have climbed, and it's been climbed. Many of them have been repeat customers, primarily Sherpas, and some other ones also. The professional mountaineers have summited, more than 2 or 3 times. Okay, and usually they are New Zealanders or Europeans, and some Brits, obviously, and some Americans. So the 12,000 times. So that's, the numbers are staggering, and it has taken all kinds, and out of which there are about 883 women, and majority of climbs have been done from the Nepali side. Now the Chinese have opened up finally, and they're able to give permits, and they've actually built a road all the way, to the foot of the Everest. So that's a lot more organized, but more on that later when we talk about mountain climbing. Okay, and the age range of climbers have varied anywhere from 14-year-old young boys to 80-year-olds, and people with severe handicap have taken this as a challenge. Blind people, double amputees, and so all types of comers have climbed on it. Okay, and this is, now we talked about Himalayas, is there's more to the region than just mountains alone, and it's full of varieties of river. Starting on the left side, the biggest rivers are Indus, and then the Satluj, which runs most majority, of course, through Pakistan. Okay, as you can see, this is Satluj, and the Indus that winds around, goes up and then winds around, type thing, and ends up in the Arabian Sea, near Karachi. Okay, and the Ganges, which travels through the Indo-Gangetic plain, and it's the holy river Ganga of India, and a huge number of population depends upon it for the lifeline of the Ganga and Yamuna, with the two rivers join, in the summer in the middle of India, and that's the holy pilgrimage site for millions of Indians. And then winds down and ends up in the Bay of Bengal, becomes a big delta, and a really waterlogged area. And at the same time, it's met by the third river, which is called a Brahmaputra. It travels, it's named differently through the Tibetan plateau called Yarlung Sampo, and then winds around, it's called Brahmaputra. And on the other side, on the eastern Himalayas, there are the other mighty rivers, not starting from the top, Yangtze and Irrawaddy, which goes down north-south to Burma or Myanmar, Salween, which is between the bordering Thailand, and the Mekong River that goes all the way through Cambodia, Laos, and through all the way through Vietnam area. Okay, so these are all the major. So you can see a huge number of people depend upon the agriculture. So one can see that this is the area which has been successful in growing rice and supporting a huge billions of people lived in the depend upon the and at the same time a huge amount of rock, crushed rock, flows down the river into the Bay of Bengal, so that there is the huge map of thousands of kilometers extends into the Bay of Bengal. Further down, all this the silt is, and that's the reasons why it's been, the ports have need a lot of dredging to remain seaworthy. Okay, and not to be now on this map, there are close to 15,000 plus, or even more than that. I mean, I think almost more than 50,000 glaciers, and the glaciers are are receding due to climate change or just natural change for whatever reasons. Okay, and initially forecast from the IPCC, International Climate Control Consortium, was that the glaciers are going to be drying up as recently as in next 5-10 years. But then they realized that their calculations were not quite on the money, and they made some retractions to that they'll perhaps last till the end of this century. Okay, and this is another nicer diagram of the Himalayan rivers. You can see that the two big rivers in India are Ganges and Yamuna. Now, the Ganges is a mispronunciation by the Brits, because the original name in Sanskrit and Hindi literature will be Ganga, Ganga, not Ganges. Okay, and Yamuna, which is the two big rivers that start from the foothills of from the Himalayan glaciers, and they have a huge role in the Hindu epics Mahabharata and Ramayana. I mean, primarily Mahabharata, and where the five good guy brothers called Pandavas, they after they won the battle and defeated the evil brothers, climbed to heaven, in the foothills of Himalayas near Mount Kailash. And also there is the story of the Lord Shiva catching Ganga in his hair locks, and due to the fact that the earth was getting hot and was catching fire due to some upsetting yogi thing. So those are some that are part of the culture and belief system of the Hindu population. And at the same time, that has amalgamated and morphed into the Tibetan culture as well, and is as part of the Buddhist culture. So those two big rivers, and on the other side is the Brahmaputra, as we talked about, Yarlung, Zampa, okay, and Sampo, sorry, and it winds around, travels first to the east, and then winds around, becomes Brahmaputra, and in Bangladesh it's called Padma. So. Okay, so those are, and there are some other rivers that jump, and historically the region. This is modern day Pakistan. This is where the peopling of Indian subcontinent took place. The original people travel along the coastline and march all the way with the first migration all the way to Australia. The second migration took place from the steppes, where and the varieties of people migrated, the hunter-gatherers and the people who had the chariots and horses, migrated into Europe, and some of the other tribes migrated to the Indo-Iranian plain. Okay, and that's the so-called Aryan migration. And there are a lot of initially these were part of the archaeological excavations, as well as linguistic correlation, and most recently with the DNA correlation, that's become finally the cause of the migration, the Great Migration that took place, and replaced or mixed with the agrarian migration from Mesopotamia, a region that took place into Europe and India. Okay, so and that took place in the area of Punjab. I should actually correct that. In the Indian epics of Vedas and other stuff, it is called Sapta Sindhu, means 7 rivers in the region of Sindhu. Now, you may be surprised with the word Sindhu, but when Alexander marched with his armies into the Indian subcontinent, the Greeks had difficulty pronouncing the word Sindhu, that's when it ended up in the Herodotus histories as Indus, and Indus ended up being India, and that's how the name India came into vogue. So that's just another sidekick. And interestingly, the Vedas and other uh, in the Puranas, the Indian religious texts, which were transmitted orally, do mention a river which starts somewhere in the modern day Pakistan and ends up in the desert region of the varieties of princely states around here. And initially, when the European and British scholars translating, reading it, they thought this was just a myth. But when the satellite images came about, that this has a lot to do with that indeed was a riverbed that has dried up, and that may have contributed to, and along with the shifting of the course of the rivers, so climate change and the river changes may have have abolished what was one of the early civilization called the Indus River civilization that was discovered as recently as 1930 when the uh, British Empire was trying to build railways in this region and came up against a mount, from which the locals were salvaging bricks, and the excavation led to whole Indus Valley civilization. And that was more or less contemporary of the Mesopotamian civilization and the Egyptian civilization. So, and as we know, most of the evolution takes place in the riverbed. So that's what, and unfortunately, unlike Rosetta Stone, there hasn't been any translation that has taken place. Okay, so that is Indus Valley civilization. Now, again, the varieties of big dams are being built, and then in Tibet there is a Medong Dam that is being proposed along the Yarlung. Okay, it's a mega dam that is proposed somewhere in this region by the Chinese. Okay, and that is going to be even bigger than Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River. Okay, an area. And there is another dam that Indian government is building in Sikkim called Testa River Dam. Is one of the largest Himalayan hydroelectric project in the Indian Himalayas. Okay, so that's a big project that is going on. And this is again the major source of river in Tibet on the eastern side. And just to say, yellow is the huge Tibetan plain. Okay, and these are the other rivers in Thailand, Burma, Vietnam, Laos, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we'll move right along. Now, some of this geology was worked out by the British East India Company employers. Now, these were the people who were the product of the Enlightenment and of the formal education that people received in the various starting disciplines of geology, botany, and fossil studies or archaeology that was available to. And the one name that deserves to be a big mention, there are a huge list of them, the so-called empire builders who had intellectual curiosity and the vigor to pursue their interest on their own time while trying to keep companies' accounts, trying to do trade, and at the same time administer millions of natives. Okay, one of them who needs to be mentioned was Dr. Hugh Faulkner. He was a medical man and he had interest in geology, having studied geology in Edinburgh, and had interest in botany, had interest in archaeology and paleontology. These were the scientists who were just arising, in Europe. And the guy named James Hutton had written one of the first geology books in English language, and it challenged the biblical idea of origin of Earth, that the Earth was not just built by God in 4000 BC, okay, on a fixed time and a fixed date, okay, but it was a lot older based on the study of the rocks. And the varieties of scholars of that time, including physicists and various polymath like Lord Kelvin and other peoples, had questioned that. Then this was the timing was set for Darwin, who studied after his famous voyage, to the Galapagos, that the Earth is a lot older, and the evolution was a slower process than just 4,000 years. So now, initially, a lot of these people were very pious. They were the good students of the church, and they believed the church doctrine. But as they intellectually started questioning this, they realized that the earth is a lot older. And finally, and there were two schools of thought. By this time, people had proposed that the volcano, the center of the earth, the mantle of the earth, was hot and lava. And so there were two on the other side. So they were called the volcanists, and the other side they were Neptunists, and they had discovered sea fossils on the top of the mountain ridges in Scotland and also on the coast of England. Okay, so that was so two schools of thought were there, and that's the argument where very ferocious people were strongly believers, and by that time, with the expanding empire, various fossils were sent from all over the world, and the idea of evolution was gradually being accepted, and the great debate that took place between Charles Darwin's bulldog, guy named Huxley, and Reverend Wilberforce. Yes, the same Wilberforce who abolished slavery. Okay, and in the British Empire. And at the same time, Dr. Faulkner was away from the main theater and argument, but was doing his shares and was collecting fossils. And he was running into these foothills of Himalaya hills of fossils of apes, crocodiles, and tortoises. Okay, and these were obviously, the Indian Maharajas and people. They collected some of these fossils, but they had no idea how to date them. And so Dr. Faulkner had evidence of corresponding with the European scholars and was able to support and gradually converted from the creationist theory to believing what Darwin was talking about. And at the same time, he was also instrumental in trying to, and now he had traveled to, he was posted in the kingdom of Awa, which is part of Burma, or in this, just directly east of Assam, in the eastern part, just east of Calcutta. Okay, so he had seen some of the flora and fauna, and realized that the climate of Darjeeling was similar to that of China, where tea was grown. And so they decided to plant a tea plantation in Assam, giving rise to the Indian tea industry. And so these were, and at the same time, just on his original thoughts, he had said that the evolution was a very slow and gradual process, taking millions of years. But at the same time, this was followed by rapid expansion. So, and this was more groundbreaking ideas, even outdoing what Darwin had proposed. Then instead of gradual change, okay, this was called rapid expansion. This was later on proposed by the American geologists, Stephen Jay Gould and Eldridge, something called the punctated equilibrium. Okay, so, but that's, we're digressing into evolution. Now, so by this time, Hutton, and who had proposed the geological textbook, had proposed the idea, okay, that the coast of, and even Darwin had said that the coast of Africa was very similar to that of South America we had traveled. Okay, but they had no way of proving this. Now again, the botany came to the ridge. There was a tree called Glossopteris, and the same tree was seen in Australia, at the same time in Madagascar, and even in South America. So obviously the tree cannot travel through the open oceans. So that gave the idea that yes, that perhaps all these land masses were connected. And then the whole idea was proposed that the whole continent was joined at one time called Gondwana, and then the continents broke up millions of years ago in the Permian era, and then that led to formation of continents as we know it. As you can see, based on plate tectonics, and the time sequence of the bottom right corner tells you as to how it had gone on for last 250 million years. Okay, and now the biggest migration in so-called plate tectonic took place from the subcontinent of India, which is originally part of Antarctica and southern Africa. And it broke loose due to plate tectonics, and within a span of 30 million years, from 80 million to 50 million years, migrated very rapidly in a geological time scale through what was known as, obviously there was no Indian Ocean at that time because there was no India. Okay, so it traveled through ocean at a very rapid rate over 30 million years and literally rammed into the coast of Laurentia, which is the European Asian landmass. Okay, and obviously this big collision that took place caused rise when the Indian subplate uh, rammed underneath the Asian plate, and that goes to the rise of Himalayas. And and this was again confirmed with later geological research, okay, that took place. So we'll dwell more into it as we move along. And so this is again another cartoon based on various isotope studies of the rocks. And you can see that the Indian landmass is separated about 80 million ago and gradually moved in and rammed into it. And this is Zanskar, which is part of the Tibetan plateau, and and the plate is subducting underneath on the eastern side. Okay, so and this was again confirmed by the discovery of the oldest fossils, which would normally be found at the bottom of the sea. They're found on top of the Himalayas. So again, giving some proof that the crinoid, or the earliest round shell-like creatures. I'll have some examples of it goes about. And then later on, with the cooling of the earth and the glaciation that took place, and the varieties of ice ages came about. Okay, and so the Tethys Sea, which was named, separated Gondwana and Laurentia. And so this theory was proposed by a German named Alfred Wegener. Okay, and it was controversial for a while. And, and after the geological as well as chemical evidence of analysis, it's become the main accepted point. And then more and more fossils have been discovered, and the other fossil, the precious stone that is considered religious, is called shaligram, and that's part of the sea animal ammonite fossil, and it is worshipped, by the locals. And now this is a satellite image story, and this is looking at the south side to the Indian subcontinent, and the white are the Himalayan mountain plates, okay, and the gray one is the Tibetan plateau, which is actually lateral extruding. So the plate is extending towards the east, and at the same time the Himalayas have a southward thrust. So there is still actual plate tectonics that is placing place. And with this, and with this folding of the rock that takes place, there is obviously the valleys develop in between two, and that gives rise to the great diversity of flora and fauna. Okay, and there are in between, what is Nepal is in the valley, so you can see that's why the large population is able to grow and survive in this area. And so there are varieties of suture lines, as you can see from here. This is the Indus River suture that follows the Indian. At the same time, on the Tibetan side, the black one is also a suture line, so there will be a very earthquake-prone zone. Okay, and there are varieties of rocks that that have been found. I'll have a slide for that. So the three main types of rocks that have been discovered on the top of the Everest, mountain climbers, in collaboration with the geologists, have gone to the top of Everest and have collected rocks. The top layer is what is limestone, followed by the yellow band of marble rock, followed by the lowest granite, which is the hard. Now, so these are the three rocks, and these have been studied chemically and analyzed and dated with isotopes, and that's how they're able to determine the age of the rocks. And so there's mountain formation, and when people started looking at it from the air, they could see the suture lines as to how the mountain folding process took place. The mountains not only rose, but all the earlier lava folded and thrust up to rise to further rising the Himalayan mountains. And at the same time, the chemical analysis from the rocks, they've been able to discover elements such as aluminum silicate that requires a huge heat and chemical reaction to form this type of chemicals. At the same time, lower down, the molten rock granite has white streaks, which shows that this was lava that condensed, and it required a temperature as high as 4,000 Fahrenheit. And not only that, these mountains, due to this process, is still continuing due to the gradual, ever so slow, but thrust of the Indian subcontinental plate. So the Indian subcontinental plate is migrating gradually northwards. And that's one of the reasons for the mountains are still growing, albeit at a slow rate of 2 inches per year. Now, but that's not the end of the story. End of the story is that there's still erosion that takes place from the glaciers of the mountain. So between the two, what is the thing? Are the mountains shrinking or rising? Well, the real scientific answer has become apparent by placing GPS equipment on top of the mountains that shows that indeed the net sum is that the mountains are slowly growing. Okay, so it will take again millions of years, but they will continue to rise. Okay, and the mountains have not only just a local effect, but have a so-called negative greenhouse effect affecting the climate. And these mountains are high enough that when the cold winds and from the hot Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean come, the mountains, the winds capture huge amount of moisture, giving rise to the proverbial and predictable monsoon in the Indian subcontinent. And that again, that gives the rise to the. Now, interestingly, you'll see in some of the other slides that I talked about that even though India's area is 1/3 the size of the United States, the arable land is almost equivalent. So that explains to the reason why that region was able to support a large amount of population, because obviously we're not going to grow a whole lot of stuff in the Nevada desert. But India has desert, but that's a relatively small area. That's why they were able to support for thousands of years large population. Okay, and this is a nice example from Professor Mike Searle, who is the Don of is an Oxford Don, an expert on Himalayan geology. And here is him showing from one of his videos, the fossil that he's able to open quickly. It's a basically a limestone type of rock, and you can see the sea ammonite. This is called the Shivalik rock. Okay, and this is one of the earliest fossils, the ammonites. So again, proving that the Himalayas were once at the bottom. Now this is the so-called much more complicated side, the crustal structure of the Himalayan and South Tibet. Okay, which is how the central thrust and boundary thrust. So, but again, the Asian plate is migrating up, and the Himalayan plate is, pushing itself underneath it gradually. So you can just see how the 18 millimeters. So, and that gives you rise to as one is migrating slower. Okay, so that the mountains are getting higher and higher. That's the point. So, and there are the various suture lines that we talked about earlier in the other pictures. And this again, that is the earthquakes are very common. The earthquake in red is the one that took place in 2015. Okay, and even as recently as just a few weeks ago, there was a smaller earthquake in eastern Tibet. Okay, and so this is affecting not just the area of in the Himalayan region, but if it affects the whole world, and because this the mountains, the cool air, when it rains over the mountain range, it picks up the carbon dioxide and the carbonic acid, it cools down the earth. So it's kind of a reverse carbon cycle. So, okay, it takes place. And these are some of the erosions that took place, the Annapurna, which was the big mountain that we talked about, and as the whole side of the mountain, was eroded with landslide. Okay, and the western face of the Annapurna collapsed, causing a lake which flooded, and a huge amount of landslide that took place. You can see this massive chunk that broke loose and literally wiped out the city of one of the third largest city in Nepal called Pokhara, which was wiped out. Okay, and so the disasters are of massive proportions. And here's an example from his Professor Searle's slide, that this is his whole village in the valley that was there. Okay, and this is the Langtang village, ice avalanche after the earthquake, said in 25 years. So there's absolutely nothing there, that has been wiped out. Okay, and these are the various earthquake regions in 2015, the so-called Gorkha earthquake, and the aftershocks have taken place. So it's not the easiest place to road. Okay, and the mountain rose by 1 meter in 3 seconds, and all the villages were destroyed, and okay, so and all right. Now moving back, so let's continue our journey from east to the west. Okay, and the 3 mountain ranges we talked about: Hindu Kush, which is the Islamic word for killing the Hindus; Karakoram, which means the black stone; and the Himalayas, which is the abode of the snow. And there is one small town called Jagot in Pakistan, in the northern Pakistan, in the Gilgit Valley, where all the 3 mountain ranges literally come together, and that's the confluence of the Indus and the Gilgit River, and that's so it's an interesting spot type of thing. So and so the Hindu Kush range extends along the western Pakistan and Afghanistan and Jaglot, so these are the rivers that meet together, and with the Chinese help, through the Pakistan and the Karakoram mountain, the China has built the so-called what is known as the Karakoram Highway, which gives them an easy route to the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of the Arabian Gulf as well. Okay, so the Chinese technology and investment has paid off for that area. Now the other we'll talk about the Everest, but these were the explorers who deserve not at this stage. The one that along with the Everest we need to mention was a British explorer named Godwin Austen. And so K2 was originally named Godwin Austen. And again, just like it's typical for that era, he wore many hats, or was a polymath. He was not only a soldier, but a topographer, surveyor, geologist, ornithologist, and malacologist. Now, I had to look up what a malacologist was. That means it's a specialized in mollusks. And last but not the least, he was interested in Islam as well as Buddhism, and converted to obviously after studying all the philosophy, he liked the Buddhist philosophy, so he can be officially called as the first Buddhist in Britain. Okay, and so these people were intrepid explorers of this area, and 19th century was be considered age of passes, because they were afraid, they were spying on the Russian Empire and were curious in exploring the region for the natural curiosity. And this was the heydays of geology and geography. Okay, and now at this time, this region there was not only just the Russians and the Brits, but the Afghan and the Sikh were being explored. Now, some of you may not be familiar with what a Sikh is, but I'll mention it in the next few minutes. Another equally interesting was famous glaciers. They have been named after the people who were the first Europeans who traveled in that region. Whitney Glacier, he was again, just like he was a lawyer, bird traveler, and he traveled all over the world, not just in the British Empire, but Americas, Mexico, and again, and at the same time was a spy for the Great Game, which was the tussle that took place between the British India and the Russian Empire. Now, again, now there was culture and civilization way before the Brits came about, or even before Islam. And this just would give you an idea of Mahajan Padas, means the big establishments, big kingdoms. Janapada means people's republic, so to speak. Okay, Jana means people in Sanskrit. Maha means great. Okay, so the great as well as the smaller, kingdoms or establishments, you can see that this is 500 before the current era. The Achaemenids is the Persian Empire of those days. This was way before Islam. Okay, and these are there were varieties of small and big areas. In the central area, the big kingdom called Avanti, and in the foothills of Himalayas, this was a small kingdom called Magadha, which will factor largely when we talk about the first person to control the India as an empire from north to south. Okay, in a few minutes. And at the same time, there were other enacts of culture called Gandhara culture, which was the early Buddhist kingdom in this region. Now, and shortly after this, Alexander appears in this scene around 300 BC current era. Okay, and he encounters this kingdom called Magadha, which had by this time had conquered all the smaller areas and had expanded all the way from here to south, Okay, and that gives the uh, idea to the British researchers, language specialists, and archaeologists to put a time date on the Indian history and coincide with the European uh, history written primarily by Herodotus and later on by Pliny. Okay, and around here, and later on, there were some of the earliest schools of learning that took place in area called Takshashila. Okay, again, the European name has been mispronounced as Taxila, or the official name is called Takshashila, Taksshila, and in this region called Gandhara. Okay, this figures widely into the Indian epics of Mahabharata. Okay, and these were schools of religious schools, as well as studying mathematics, astronomy, astrology, and logic and languages, called Gandhara region. Okay, and later on, this goes on to a whole kingdom in Bactria, which was the amalgamation of the Greek as well as Indian culture of the Bactrian Empire that lasted from before the current era to about 800 AD, and obviously later on was absorbed and taken over by the Islamic rise that started from Arabia further around here, and it wiped out the whole Persian Empire and became Islamic. Okay, and the rise of Islam obviously had a huge influence on all this region. Okay, including but not the least for India. Okay, starting from 700 current era in modern day Sindh, and later on the Delhi Sultanate in 1200 AD, and later on followed by the Mongols, who were Muslim by that time. Okay, so enough idea about the history, but that's another talk altogether. Okay, and this is again shows that unlike Hinduism and Buddhism coincided and absorbed elements from each other, but but Islam was not that kind, and most of you would recognize this. This took place, very recently by the crazes of Taliban, where they destroyed the Banyan Buddha, which was in the where near the Bagram Air Force Base in modern day Afghanistan. Okay, and on the other hand, the approach by the Christian or the Buddhist scholars or East India Company scholars was totally different. They were genuinely curious as to the archaeological artifacts that they were discovering during their hunting, as well as just plain exploration that took place starting from Burma, okay, where it was a kingdom of Ava, and in Sri Lanka or Ceylon, which they were going not just for science but for exploring for spices, and of nutmeg and pepper on the south coast of India. The race was on between the Dutch and the Brits, and whosoever had the bigger navy was winning. Okay, and the local kings were not going to let them come in very quickly, but finally the ones with the bigger guns won, and the more disciplined won. And what they discovered, there was a whole new religion which they had no knowledge about it, and the word Buddha came up appearing not just in Burma, India, and Southeast Asia, okay, And that's led to the discovery that there has to be a common link. And at the same time, some of the archaeological discovery of the stone pillars and mountainside carvings were coming into exam. And a lot of these scholars put their heads together, finally pinning down that the origin of all these artifacts and the different linguistic mentioning of Buddha had something to do with India and the foothills of Himalayas. And that's the story of the rediscovery of Buddhism, which was vanquished after for 1,000 years in the Indian subcontinent. Okay, and again, just to mention, this is, I mean, sorry, I didn't finish all my talk about the eastern part. Okay, and the one of the as we were traveling from east to west, Siachen glacier, which was one of the longest glaciers in the Karakoram range, and it's about 47 miles, and it's right on the border, contested border of Ladakh between India and Pakistan, and the line of control that was formally or informally agreed under the auspices of the United Nations and in the Ladakh region. But both the army posts are within staring distance of each other. And this was one of the highest battles that took place when the Pakistanis made some rather brave advances with the so-called irregulars and the freedom fighters and infiltrators during the Musharraf administration in 1919. And there was one of the highest wars that took place at 20,000 feet in Kargil War. And obviously, finally nobody came out as a victor. And finally, the borders did not shift that much. And the story that I had read in some these magazines that at this time the war was the Pakistanis were losing it, and they were almost very close to using atomic weapons. And finally, the Bill Clinton and had intervened, and then the war was actually cooled the temperature at that time. At the same time, the Indian businessmen had also made plea to New Delhi and to traveling to cool down the warring parties. Now, those of you who were reading National Geographic back in the 80s and 90s may have read this story about the Kalash people. Now, this is, I mean, I'm not going to go back to the slides earlier, but you can see there is a small region of Afghanistan that extends between the stans or Tajikistan and in Kashmir and Pakistan. So these are, and this in the valley people were left isolated into their own devices, and they practiced the so-called animism religion of their own until the big wave of Islam swept over, and the various invaders from Ghazni, which is Pakistan, invaded and forcefully converted them. But they accepted Islam grudgingly, and they are not gung-ho or hard-nosed Islamic, but they are the Kalash people, and either due to genetic isolation or due to mixed inheritance, that appearance is different, and they have a more European, Asian, a mountain type people. You can see they're quite fair skinned, and they are not exactly hijab wearing people, wearing black or white for that matter, and and they have their own lifestyle with different celebration, which are more animistic, ritualistic, as well as Islam. But they don't go around, covering their heads and faces, and you can see that they're primarily, so this was a type of ancient Hinduism, and now been Muslim. So, and this may have factored in the region called Kafristan that was mentioned in the early days, but is now considered a pejorative term. Okay, and this may have been one of the inspirations to Rudyard Kipling when he wrote the story of the man who would be king. Okay, so this is the Kalash people, and some very colorful festivals, and a happy-go-lucky type of people. Okay, now moving from Pakistan to India is not for the not exactly walk through the fence like United States and Canada, even though now even that may be getting contentious. Okay, there are only one or two checkpoints which are heavily armed by both armies, and they put up a nice show of taunting each other, of flag lowering ceremony, which again makes for a great show for the people. Okay, and I'll play this video if I can. Hopefully, I can. This is the Pakistani side, and you can see that's the Pakistani flag being waved by the local. Okay, so I think you've seen enough. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to stop it now and then. Okay, but you can find it on YouTube. There is a link that I've posted. Okay, so and you can see it's a big show for the local people type of thing. It's but unfortunately, even if you are in the Karakoram and can cross on foot through the mountains, you're not allowed to do that. Okay, so even if you are an intrepid traveler and appeal to the soldiers or the colonels or who are marking, they won't let you cross, and you have to go all the way down to Lahore and only cross at one checkpoint where the gates open only a certain time and after multiple stamping and waiting in line. Okay, now getting back to the plains, as you have to cross across through the plains, and this gives me a good way to introduce a smaller but important religion sect that rose around 1200 current era, and taking the most elements of Islam as well as Hinduism, called Sikhism. So they took the discipline and a universality of Islam and abolished the caste. And at the same time, did not and that was called Sikh religion. So they adopted the few elements of clean living and wearing a turban, carrying a small dagger. Okay, and became adopted by the Brits as called the martial race. And from a small kingdom with various gurus, they had a good king named Ranjit Singh. He was self-made man and employed French mercenaries who were the rejects or the after the defeat of Napoleon army, and who were soldiers of fortune, and trained his army in European fashion. And when the British Empire wanted to expand to Russia and the Sikh army. They were afraid that they would be lining up and with the Russians, so they decided to, take them on and expand the empire to Afghanistan and push the Russians back into their, into Europe, so to speak. And so the Sikhs wars were very ferocious, and that's a time when the well-equipped, well-trained East India Company army met a match. And eventually, after the death of Ranjit Singh, and with poor leadership, the Sikhs lost the Third Sikh War and became very loyal soldiers in the British Army, and served gallantly in various theaters in the expanding British Empire in Southeast Asia, uh, Burma, Malaya, and First and Second World Wars. And then the Brits had the idea of certain people were so-called martial races, and the Sikhs were right on top, along with the Rajputs, who were the princely states of a desert area, and later on the Gurkhas. So these were the three of their favorite so-called martial races. And this is their famous Golden Temple, which was built, in around 1200 or 1600, and was destroyed, rebuilt by the Islamic invasion from the Muslim kings of Delhi, as well as the Afghan Ghaznis and who invaded. And finally, it was rebuilt by the Sikh king Ranjit Singh in around 1830s or so, and it's a gold covered, golden temple of Amritsar, which is the big city in Punjab, and was where the huge Sikh population lives. Now, interestingly, that's not just the worship of the Sikh faith, but they also provide a free kitchen, but managed strictly by volunteers, okay, who serve free food, a very simple rice and lentil food with a small sweet to anybody who walks in. Don't have to be Sikh, and they feed as many as 100,000 devotees or tourists, in the community kitchen daily. And during the holidays or special occasions, the number may double to 200,000, and that is strictly done voluntarily. And so that's right to be seen. You can find that on video. So it's a massive operation for, And now again, so from Islamabad we cross over into India, and then later on we'll move further north into the mountains. So we crossed over at Amritsar, where I talked about, which is the Golden Temple. Then we'll move into the area of Kashmir, which is a story into itself. It's a temperate region of India, and that was considered very popular summer destination for the Mughal kings who built the various gardens there, and at the same time for the British, and lastly, and that is an interesting story that had initially had a Hindu population, but was forcefully converted with the advent of Islam. And a small Hindus became minority, and they were called Pandits. And Prime Minister Nehru's family was the Pandit family who to make better fortunes, had to move down to the southern plains. And there's still a sizable Pandit population, and that's been put under pressure by the rise of militant Islam. Okay, and now it became a pawn between. It was conquered by the Sikh and so-called another tribe of a martial race called Dogra, Dogra, and they stayed loyal to the British Empire, and they were rewarded by giving Kashmir, because they not only helped financially but militarily when the East India Company was fighting the Sikhs. So they were given this territory. So what ended up happening was that predominantly Muslim population came under a Hindu king, and you can see that the trouble brewing, and it continued. Now, and the Brits left the princely states alone, even though some of them were very poor administrators, and and again with the freedom fighter, they didn't allow any of this freedom movement to become thing. And at the time of independence, the Maharaja was in double minds and decided not to side with either of the two new countries that were forming. And then the Pakistanis, and the word Pakistan is an interesting thing because the lawyers who were wanted a independent Muslim state, country rather, coined up with the area of Pakistan. Is P is for Punjab, K is for Kashmir, S is for Sindh, and and N is for Northwestern Frontier Territories. Okay, so that's how the word Pakistan was coined. Okay, so they wanted to take over Kashmir, and instead of seeking a political solution, okay, with discussion, they decided to send so-called irregular Afghans to take over Kashmir. And at the last minute, the Maharaja of Kashmir decided to join the Indian Union, and the Indian Army, airlifted troops and was able to control part of the Kashmir, the 2/3 of the Kashmir. Okay, and then again at the same time, some of the freelancing British soldiers wanted to help the Pakistanis, because they thought that they would give them a window to keep an eye onto the heretic communists from Russia and China. So they become a part of the political football. Okay. Now later on, and the Indian establishment in Delhi did not listen to the Muslim sensitivities and tried to rig the elections from time to time. And that started with the rise of militant Islam. It has become a political football, and the locals are caught in between that now. And they are more Shiites. They are not more fundamentalist Sunnis. Okay. Now again, getting out to the politics. This was the earlier thing. The Srinagar, there are a lot of houseboats, and people live in their houseboat. They sell vegetables, and these are the areas which is more temperate, and they can grow apples and walnuts. And so it's one of the beautiful areas in the foothills of Himalayas, and become a huge romantic phase of writing varieties of poem in Persian as well as in English. And you remember the famous songs of Pale Hands besides Kashmir, and all these boats are named after the Victorian who is who. Okay. And the famous part of the Kashmir were the not Kashmiri shawls, which were popular all over the world, and even in the European establishment. This is made from fine wool that comes from Tibetan antelopes and Tibetan goats, which is a really fine, and they're hand woven. Then the varieties of shawl called Khani and Paisley shawls, and these were prized by the Mughal kings, and were given as a ceremonial gift to the visitors, who is who, and at the same time were valued by the rich European establishment. And you can see the design is very exquisite, and is well summarized in this picture. And the words that entered the language called the Pashmina shawls and Khani shawls. Okay, and these are varieties of handcrafted, and it takes several months, if not a year. And now on the western side, it comes, we are getting into the Buddhist culture of Tibet, and this is bordering, Tibet and the Buddhist influence region of Ladakh, as we talked about. And this part was again very sparsely populated, and the borders were very poorly defined between the Kashmiri Maharajas and the Tibetan kings. And by this time in the 19th century, China was weak, and they had their own problems with the Boxer Rebellion and the rebellion in the South China, and millions of people were killed. So they're from the Peking establishment, who had very little interest. And when the borders were decided by the East India Company with Tibetans, then they were ill-defined, and the Chinese did not have much say in it. And obviously, and the borders were so poorly underpopulated. And finally, with the rise of communist China, China decided to build a road, and that's called the Aksai Chin Road, connect Mongolia all the way to Tibet, which they took over by force in 1950 and kicked out the Dalai Lama. And they've successfully built the road that extends all the way from border of Inner Mongolia or to the northern border, extending to the western border of China, and building a road all the way to Guangxi province. So the western and the whole this thing, there has been a highway, which is one of the longest highway that's been built, which is called 10,000 miles literally. Okay, it winds around. And this part was surveyed by the East India Company when they were investigating the magnetic field of the Earth in this mountainous region. And they had hired some, clever German geologists who were investigating this. And unfortunately, one of them ventured into Kashgar and this thing and was caught by the Muslim Sultan and was beheaded. Okay, because they were suspected to be spies. Okay, so the history is complicated. Okay, so continuing the recording. Now we were talking about the rivers, and the big river that is Ganges, and in the Indian epics, the Mahabharats and the Puranas, it was mentioned that the Ganga or Ganges rose from the Himalayas, and obviously, when the Western scholars read this, that they thought, oh, this was just fab and this thing, and they thought the river would be arising in some lake or something like that. So they didn't believe it. And finally, when the mountain climbers started going around, and we were able to trace the route, okay, and they were able to find that the river actually did arise in the glacier, and the glacier which arose called Gangotri, okay, in Sanskrit, and that was that it's considered a holy site of Hindus, and actually, the Sanskrit epics thought that it looked like a cow's mouth, and when they actually saw that yes, that there was indeed it does have a big appearance of a mouth, and with the water arising from it giving rise to the appearance of tongue, and it's one of the largest fresh water outside of Antarctica. But the glacier, as it happens with many glaciers, is retreating at 19 meters per year. And in that area, it is considered, it has a different name. It's called Bhagirathi River, and it meets another tributary called Alaknanda. And the mythological thing is that the river arises, descended from heaven on Shiva's head, and he caught it, to cool the earth. Okay, and there is so much water that it can be labeled as the third pole. Okay, of and the Shivalinga is mythologized as a phallic symbol and is worshipped, as part of the Trimurti or the three gods, the creator, destroyer, and and these are some areas of pilgrimage that takes place into the Hindu pilgrimage area. It's a place called Badrinath, where the river arises, and finally that tower to the gorges. And these have been named for in the Hindu epics of Vedas, which are dated to at least 1500 before the current era, and it's also part of the Buddhist pilgrimage area. Okay, and and now initially those were hard places for pilgrimage, and only the few hardy souls and the yogis traveled there because it was cold and inaccessible in the region. As you can see, if I can magnify that to some extent. Okay, let's see if I'll try to show it to here. Okay, yeah, see, Badrinath is way up there. And these are the four areas of the four pilgrimages: East Coast, West Coast, and North and South. So these are the big holy pilgrimage sites for Hinduism. Okay, and you can see in the foothills, it would be obviously very hard to travel. Now the Indian government, after 1962, when they were shocked by the Chinese, they have decided to build roads and becomes a regular tourist. It's not as hard as it used to be. Now, and as I mentioned earlier, that the Buddhism was very, started in India around 300 current before the current era, but then had resurgence and was vanquished and disappeared after around 1000 current era, and due to revival of Hinduism by a sage or a philosopher named Shankaracharya, and again, the temple destruction took place, and a resurgence of Brahmin culture took place. Okay, and these are again, then the mountains are always worshipped by many cultures, not just in Christianity and a big stone of Islam, but also in Hinduism. And this is the sacred mountain called Mount Kailash, which is not that high a mountain, but it is heavily anchored in the Hindu sacred mythology. It is called the abode of the Lord Shiva. And again, in Tibetan culture, it's also named Ganga Rinpoche. And so the Hindus, pilgrims, it's considered, mountain climbing is considered, sacrilegious. But going around the mountain, walking on your feet, which is about 50 kilometers or so, that is considered wiping out your sins. And next to that, there is also a sacred lake called Mansarovar. And so taking a bath in it, again, considered very religious. And now, unlike the Hindus, the Tibetans take it the harder way. They actually prostrate, going around, now that can be considered, it's very hard, but they would go around taking several weeks going around the whole mountain to wash out their sins and to pray. And this was again traveled by the Jesuit missionaries, okay, named with a nice Italian name called Ippolito Desideri and Manuel Fretre. In 1715, they went around, the first one to visit this Mount Sarovar in Kailash area. Okay, and it's next to that, it's considered Mount Meru, which is again considered not to be confused with the Mount Meru in Tanzania. Okay, and that is relatively smaller, but again, it's a challenging mountain called Mount Meru. It got the same name for whatever reasons, and it gets a bit confusing. And so there is a Mount Meru, is also used in some of the Indian mythology as Mount Kailash, which is the same mountain. So obviously that's a taboo to climb that mountain. Okay. All right. Now, India is a sacred geography. As India is unity as a nation has been constituted by actually more pilgrimage, and the religion has converted, because one can see that. Let's analyze that historically. A lot of areas where Islam spread, and they managed to convert a lot of these people. Okay, and as you can see that, but India managed to remain the Hindu identity, even though, and perhaps because there are larger numbers, and the Islam found it difficult to forcefully convert them. But at the same time, Indians for 500 years or even almost 1,000 years were kept as second-class citizens. They could collaborate with them, they could work as accountant and soldiers or number two men, okay, but they would never become, really the powers to be. And so this is a book written by a American scholar named Diane Eck. It's called Sacred India, the Sacred Geography. So that takes into account all the myths and the belief system as the pilgrimage sites. And it's a book written in 2012, but it hasn't changed that much. It talks about all the Puranas and the beliefs. Just a second, okay, I will have to pause this for a second, and then I will resume in just a second. Okay, continued. So that's something that may be of interest to those of you who want to know more about it. Okay, and okay, now afterwards, from 300 current era to 1000 was considered some of the golden era of the Hindu culture, and Hindu as well as Buddhist culture. That's where the great, just like the Shakespeare wrote the plays and is well venerated in the British the literature, the same way there was a writer named Kalidas, who wrote a lot of plays and poems, epic poems, and these were translated later on by the Indology scholars into English and later on into German. And they admired the poetic lifestyle of writing and the stories. And one of the plays in which he describes the glory of the Himalayas. Now, as a lot of you studied Latin and Greek, if you went to very special schools or public schools, or even India and more high school that offered the classic languages. This way, in India, we were offered the choice of learning Sanskrit or Persian. Okay, and obviously, a lot of the Hindu boys preferred Sanskrit. So this is for me, it's easy to read this, easily, and I can just read this as easily as you can read Spanish, perhaps. So. Asyuttara yataha dishihi devatatma Himalayo nama nagadiraja purvapuro toyanidhi vigraha sthita prithvivya eva manakanda. Okay, so what that translates is to in the northern direction, Uttara means northern, Dishi means Disa, Devatma, supreme god, Himalaya, Nama, Nagadiraja means mountain. Okay, so it's, he describes, this is the opening words of Kalidasa play called Kumara Sambhavam, okay, and describes the glory of the Himalayas, and then it gets into the kings and their machinations that takes place. And so this is a translation. I'm just amazed as to how one can find on internet now. So we are living in the golden age of information. Okay, so but I'm digressing. So okay, so this was, so it's part of the Hindu culture, and it's the culture of the subcontinent, and it was a very poetic writing which people, even the German scholars like Max Muller and Goethe wrote, and some of the English translated the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and these plays, and they admired the writing, okay, and so the Vedic civilization. So and so this was, a cultural learning that took place of cross culture, okay. Okay, and obviously we cannot not mention the mountains without mentioning yogis, and so the yogis really have some superhuman physiological abilities. You can see how this gentleman is quite elderly, is his dreadlocks, and is a lot more limber as a young skater or a gymnast for that matter. And the yogis, and the Himalayas have. And they started out, with the classic biography that was published in the 1930s by a yogi named Paramhamsa Yogananda, who wrote the autobiography of Yogi, which became a bestseller and introduced yoga to the Western world. Okay, and in the 1930s, yoga became very popular in the Hollywood, in Europe, and as well as in England, and had resurgence back in the 60s, and later on with the rise of the easy travel, and obviously with the rise of drug culture, a lot of people who were disillusioned with the war and the materialistic structure of Western society sought refuge in the Indian traditions. And this again, and the autobiography of yoga introduced the mysterious figure of Maha Avatar Babaji, an immortal yogi who gave varieties of branches of yoga, one of called Kriya Yoga, was introduced to the world at that time. Okay, so and then the two big religious places in the Indian mythology, the churning of the ocean is a big mythological thing, and it says that the ocean was churned between the fight of the evils and the good guys, the Devas and the Asuras that took place, and the was spelled at 4 drops, which became the place of the pilgrimage. And Rishikesh is considered literally by the West as, during where the Ganges originates and enters the plain, it's like the yoga capital of the world. Okay, and you can see there are varieties of pilgrimages sites that take place in the area called Himachal Pradesh, one of the Indian states, and Uttarakhand, and which are not only just religious but the yogis' place of culture. And it introduces the West by the none other than the Fab Four, who traveled at the insistence of, I think, George Harrison's wife, traveled to yoga and met the great Maharshi Yogi, who is right behind, who introduced the concept of transcendental meditation, to the West. And obviously, it has been well promoted by Deepak Chopra, and may have some, introduced the concept of quick mindfulness to the West. Okay, all right. Okay, and again, just you can see that this was not all considered cult, but even it continues that recently a young lady was, I don't think her real name is ever published, but she was a young Jewish woman who was a Stanford PhD student who was traveling with her a boyfriend, come husband later on, and to the Himalayas, and decided that she traveled to the Ganges River and decided to live into the ashram. And she was allowed to find it. So came across this book. It was on the display counter at the local library, From Hollywood to Himalayas. And I was not aware of it, but obviously she's converted to the yogic philosophy, stayed there, and has become a spokesman for the intercultural interfaith association between the West and the East, and has become a sadhvi, means really a nun, or with an assumed Hindu name called Bhagavati Saraswati. When she came back to San Francisco area with her Jewish parents, they were suspicious that she has been converted to a cult. And after she met the yogi, who was her mentor, they finally decided, yeah, that was all on the level, and she really believed in the philosophy, and it was actually doing. But she, taught various children, converted and established a good dialogue of philosophy, and from Hollywood to Himalaya. So this is her book, and she has traveled all over the West, including the U.S. And my sister told me, that, oh yeah, I know her. I met her in Louisville. So she has, really made a bridge between cultures. And here's her book, with a tribute from Jane Goodall. Okay, and this again, that we talked about the Everest mountains, type of thing. So, but I'm sorry, I should have moved this slide over. Okay, I already missed. And then this is one has to give credit. There was always this myth in the medieval Christianity about this Prester John Myth, who had traveled to the West and had discovered, a new land and kingdom, basically, and that continued, through the William of Rubric, and then the part of Christianity that traveled in the Middle Ages, to the West. And you can see that they traveled the land right all the way to Mongolia, into the region of Monkey Khan. And, he was favorably receptive to the idea of a Nestorian Christianity, which was again looked down upon because there was some schism that took place between the Catholic Church as well as the Nestorians. Okay, and again, and during the story is that the great descendant of Genghis Khan, named Monkey Khan, who had the debate between the Muslims, Buddhists, and Nestorians. Okay, and again, for whatever reasons, he decided to give support to the Buddhist, and that's how Mongols ended up being Buddhist. And later on, obviously, became Islamic. But again, then one of his descendants was the Kublai Khan, and who ended up becoming. So that may have been the royal blessings has a lot to do with what religion would the country would adopt. Okay, and this is the famous Buddhist prayer called Om Mani Padme Hum. Okay, and again, and so William of Rubric, witnessed the Tibetan sky burial. So there are some other interesting historical links that I've posted for those of you who want to know more about it. Okay. And obviously, in the region we were traveling from east to the west, so the areas north of Ladakh, which were the small princely kingdom, or small petty states, as you would call Kumaon and Garhwal, which became absorbed in the part of Nepal and the Gurkha kingdom. Okay, and with the expanding Gurkha kingdom of Nepal, they ended up controlling it. And later on, during the Nepali-British War, the ownership of that was turned over to the British Empire, and obviously this region was mountainous, hilly, and the British administrators were the big white hunters, and one of them who was born in India, obviously an Englishman, they were considered Anglo-Indians, and he was the great white hunter. And then at that time, some of the tigers, obviously where the population was huge, and they attacked some of them who were wounded, attacked the locals, and he, wrote the book. Was a big hunter in the 30 years that where he was stationed in Kumaon, which is the mountain region of northern India, bordering Tibet. And he wrote a varieties of stories about the hunting, and some of the tigers were obviously, were attacking humans and the farming population. And so he wrote the stories of man-eaters of Kumaon. And later on, he had a change of his heart and became a conservationist. And so much so, and then he served with dignity in First World War, and now it's so much so that a national park in India is named after Jim Corbett. Okay, the Corbett National Park. So it's a fascinating story about the conversion of a Englishman hunter. Okay, and later on, and they, but obviously some of them who were born in India, they were looked down upon by those who had traveled from England, and they were considered second-class citizens, even though they were white, or some of them had mixed blood at that time. And another person who deserves a nod, is a Lieutenant Philip Nemi, who was also worked in, and had worked in the Himalayas, and at the same time had fought in the First World War, and earned the Victoria Cross. Okay, and and had and for good measures, had managed to win the Olympic gold medal. So it has to have a was and and again, he was wounded in the First World War and married the nurse who looked after him. Okay, and now the conservation effort has worked more than they had expected, and Nepal just recently said that they have too many tigers. Okay, and the similar problems has occurred with elephants in Africa as well. Because of the growing population and the need for farming as well as conservation is becoming, really a difficult management situation. And again, I mentioned a little bit about, but I can't cover everything, but the terrain varies from a tropical zone to subtropical to temperate to alpine forest as well as to snow. So you can just see that with the climbing of the altitude, okay, that, over several kilometers, all types of flora and fauna you will see. And at the same time, some of the wildlife, that can be seen from Himalayan vultures, eagles, and the ubiquitous workhorse of the Himalayas, the yak, you can see, and the snow leopard, which is really rare to spot at the same time, and you can see the wild yaks right here. I'm sorry, I pointed to the wrong one. Okay, and then the Asian black bear, okay, as well as the red panda and the Himalayan tapir. Okay, you can see more like a pig. Okay, and the various deers and the blue sheep. Okay, and at the same time, we talked about all the parts of the yak are used by the Tibetans. The hide as well as the tail is used as a whisk, even by the Roman emperors at that time. And and then again, in the flora, the rhododendron and the varieties of butterflies, even a tiny sikkim has 60 types of orchid, and the elusive snow leopard. Okay, and last but not the least, the myth of Yeti has been witnessed by some has been described by some Europeans and is considered very much a living thing by the kingdom of Bhutan and the Bhutanese people. Okay, nobody has seen him yet, and these are some of the prettier pictures which I didn't show in the class, for sake of time. The Himalayan animals, the red panda, the blue sheep, and the snow leopard and the yak. Okay, so you can see them, in their full glory in their images. And now here, last but not the least, one can say that the Indian culture was notorious for not writing things down, and it took the Western scholars, primarily working just for curiosity and for commercial and economic reasons and trade reasons, starting from James Rennell, who wrote the first organized Western-style maps of the Indian subcontinent, Joseph Hooker, who is a well-known botanist, who collaborated with, with the Kew Garden, okay, and botanist Thomas Manning, who was a well-known sinologist, expert in China, Henry Strachey, who did investigative work in Western Tibet. Alexander Cunningham was the father of the Indian Archaeological Institute. Okay, and last but not the least, I must mention William Jones, who was a philologist par excellence and was versatile in all the European as well as Arabic and Persian languages, and established the link between Sanskrit and Bengali, Sanskrit and Latin, by the way. And last but not the least, William Moorcroft was the first veterinarian in Britain and was appointed as the superintendent of stud for East India Company. And a lot of these people carried out, the surveys of the trigonometric survey. But the linguistic link was established and that perhaps, then extended the linguistic link between Sanskrit and Latin, extended into the idea that these were the long lost brothers of Aryans, okay, and it was our mission to civilize, obvious. And these people were again, very creationist basically. So they always thought that this was all started with Adam and Eve, and so along the line they were lost with, and hopelessly until the rediscovery of Buddhist culture, which dated back to before the current era. And finally, they were able to time it with translating the Indian writings and Herodotus history, where they were able to time the Mauryan Empire that I showed you earlier, and to establish a time frame, okay, and we're able to rediscover that the grandson of the contemporary emperor from the time of Alexander, a guy named Ashoka, was the earliest Buddhist who managed to spread Buddhism all over Southeast Asia. Okay. Okay, and last but not the least, the last Englishman was John Arden and Michael Spender, who was a pioneering geologist of the Himalayas in the 1930s. And this is a recent book that was again on the displays at our local library, The Last Love and War and the End of the Empire. Okay, and Michael Spender was the first to draw a detailed map of Everest, and the younger brothers, W.H. Auden, the famous writer, poet, and Stephen Spender, literary flame, and they were, and this became a metaphor for the Britain's struggle to maintain power over India, and they were both men fell in love with the same woman, so that's decided as to where they're going to be, so it's a pretty nice yarn about a human relationship. Okay, and at the same time, jokingly, Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, used to say he was the last Englishman to rule India, because he was rich, barrister who had gone to Trinity College in Cambridge, was a lawyer, and obviously English, and was quite comfortable in traversing from both Indian as well as British culture. Okay, so we'll stop at this point. Okay, I've recorded for about 2 hours and went over by 10 minutes, added a few extra details. I'll stop at this stage, and we'll continue next week with the history of Tibet, which is a whole class in itself. Okay, stop recording.